Pnawn da, good afternoon everyone. My name is Caroline Phipps and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Barod. Croeso and welcome to our Manifesto session. This is the third in our series of 10 webinars exploring each of our asks or call to action from our Barod Manifesto, setting the blueprint for a more equal and prosperous Wales for people who use substances. So you can download the manifesto from our website, and you can also download our policy papers in both English and Welsh, which give a more in-depth overview of each of the topics that we cover in our manifesto. So these webinars offer a space to explore what each of our manifesto ask means in practice, why it matters, and how we can play a part in making it real. Moving beyond words and into action, but importantly together. And today's webinar is about a call for action for a drug overdose Good Samaritan Act to be enacted in Wales. In 2023, the most recent figures that we have, there were 377 deaths related to drug poisoning here in Wales. This was an 18.5% increase from 2022 and is the highest since records began. Each one is not just a number, but a human being like you and I. Many of these deaths are preventable if emergency help is sought quickly. However, when people experience or witness a drug-related overdose, they may be in possession of illegal drugs, and there is a real fear that those at the scene could be searched, arrested and prosecuted, and this could lead to emergency services simply not being called or people leaving the scene. A drug overdose Good Samaritan Act will provide legal protection for individuals who experience or witness a drug-related overdose. This will reduce fear of police attending or being called and encourage people to seek emergency help and ultimately save lives. So what we're asking for in our manifesto is, until any new legislation is enacted, we encourage all Welsh police forces to use their powers of discretion when attending and dealing with a suspected drug overdose. We call on the UK government to either amend the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 or establish a brand new legislation that will provide criminal immunity in the face of a health emergency, especially in the light of the global threat of synthetic opioids. And thirdly, while we recognise criminal law is not devolved, we urge Welsh Government to officially recognise the power of a drug overdose Good Samaritan in limiting the numbers of preventable drug-related deaths in Wales and calling on the UK Government to establish appropriate legislation. So without me speaking anymore, get to the people who are going to help us understand this subject more. And we're delighted to have two speakers here today. First, we have our very own Peredur Owen Griffiths, the Senedd Regional Member for Plaid Cymru and Chair of Substance Use and Addiction Cross-Party Group. Peredur is a champion of harm reduction and a great supporter of our sector. So we then have, after Peredur, we have Cory Ranger. Cory is all the way from Canada. And is a director of Harm Reduction Nurses Association of Canada, and will share with what this law looks like in practice and how effective it is. But first of all, please welcome Peredur.
Diolch, Caroline, and it's good to be with you. I'm actually not in Wales at the moment. I'm up in Scotland at a conference, so I might have to disappear a little bit later. But I'm glad this session is being recorded as well, and good to be on the website to be able to look back, because I'm really interested in seeing what Cory has to say, because I've recently been on holiday to Canada, so and to Vancouver, and I'll mention that in a bit. But as Caroline says, I'm a Plaid Cymru Member for South East Wales, and I chair the cross-party group on substance use and addiction. And part of the ethos of that group is to bring people, like-minded people, together to be able to talk about things in a safe environment, especially about drugs, about alcohol, about addictions, and to be able to work at policy from a lived experience aspect rather than from a an academic aspect, and it's more about listening to each other, having a safe space to listen to stories and then to find the similarities in our experiences and try and deliver through that a meaningful policy for Wales. And the one thing that obviously comes through from the cross-party group is that we tend to do this slightly with one arm tied behind our back, because justice isn't devolved to Wales. So obviously one of the asks that Plaid Cymru will always make is for further devolution and eventually independence, but further devolution so that we can make our own decisions to be able to have a harm reduction policy in Wales that actually works, and to be able to listen to our communities and deliver what's needed there. One of the particularly interesting things that I was hoping to get out of the session and from Cory is to understand what's happening on the ground in Canada and in Vancouver in particular. I was walking around Vancouver last week and seeing active drug use on the streets, and I did see a couple of people being attended to by the emergency services, and didn't get very close to what was going on, but it looked as though somebody was having an overdose, and my wife's cousin that we were staying with in Calgary actually works as a dispatcher for 911, and it was interesting to understand it from her point of view of what the frontline services are thinking. But obviously I'll be interested in understanding what Cory has to say from that aspect as well, to see how it's been embedded in everyday life in Canada. Going back to the manifesto that Barod has, I'm so glad that you're putting these manifestos together early for parties like mine to be able to digest what's being asked, and to then be able to work through what we're able to do and what we need Westminster government to do as well. So I think that's the big thing for me, is to understand where we can influence and where we need to influence, and where we can make those decisions. So that's really important. And I think Barod and your sister organisations in Kaleidoscope and others do fantastic work in working out some of these policy aspects, and they are tricky, and they can be controversial as well. But we have to be brave in what we do and look at the war on drugs has been going on for 40 years and we're losing it, so we need to do something different. So without any further ado, really, I'll hand over to Cory and Caroline, because I think you're more likely to get more information out of them and more interesting conversations out of them than you are from me. But I'll be listening with real interest. But diolch yn fawr, Caroline.
Diolch, Peredur. I mean, it is an interesting time as well to have, in Wales, we're coming up with elections. We are without a strategy at the moment. We are without, in a vacuum of sort of policy, really. And I think it is really important that we fill that space with evidence, with what works, and looking internationally and bringing that to Wales, which is, I think, what the manifesto is really about. And so with that in mind, Cory, please tell us a bit about yourself and how you see this act and what it's been like in Canada, and what's been good about it, and also perhaps has anything been problematic.
Really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. My name is Cory. So today I'm going to be talking about Canada's Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act, and I'm going to be telling this tale from a nurse's perspective, because I am a nurse, and so I don't profess to be a lawyer. It also has a little bit of a British Columbia focus as well. And I'll just explain a little bit about who I am, who the Harm Reduction Nurses Association is, We'll do a bit of context setting, Canada's unregulated drug poisoning emergency, and then we'll talk about the Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act, some of the debates and amendments and court challenges, and then we'll briefly touch on the lock zone and the linkages to the Act. Before I get into that, I want to acknowledge that I'm a settler on stolen lands, and so I live on unceded Cowichan tribe territory in what is colonially known as Duncan, British Columbia, Canada. And I also want to acknowledge that the content I discuss today and that I often get to discuss is made possible by people with lived and living experience of criminalized drug use, sharing their knowledge and expertise with folks like myself. I've been a nurse since 2011, and I've been a harm reduction nurse since 2013. So I've a bit of a senior now in harm reduction, in the sense that I've been working in the backdrop of Canada's unregulated drug poisoning emergency through its evolution from heroin to prescription pills to fentanyl to the iteration that we are currently in. I'm the clinical director at AVI Health and Community Services. I'm a master's student focusing on justice studies, in particular focusing on the policy implications of misinformation, disinformation, and moral panic. I'm a board of director with the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, and I'm a research and communications intern with the International Drug Policy Consortium. And I'm a tired dad of 3, and it's 6 a.m. here in Canada. So if a child walks in, that's because my family is going to start waking up shortly. The mission of the Harm Reduction Nurses Association is to promote the advancement of harm reduction nursing through practice, education, research, and advocacy. And we serve as a national voice for harm reduction and related nursing issues. We also work really closely with partners to promote and advocate for laws and policies that reduce harm, that promote equity. And there's a lot of work to be done in Canada in that regard. I won't belabor this because I'm short for time, but there's a lot of good reasons to join the HRNA. So if you're a nurse and you're watching this recording, we do have international members. Check us out. It's really important to set the table here because Canada's situation, while not entirely unique, is probably much different than yours. And so between January 2016 and December 2024, at least 52,544 Canadians have died from apparent opioid toxicity. And in British Columbia, the province that I'm currently showing up from, a public health emergency was declared on April 14th, 2016, and since then, 17,102 people have died. We know what the drivers of this emergency are. The emergency is being driven by an unregulated drug supply, which is being made increasingly more volatile by the ongoing criminalization and prohibition policies in this country. Our war on drugs began as early as 1876 with the Indian Act, and every law and policy since then related to drug use has been a tool of assimilation in Canada. We actually even have legal precedents in a recent BC Supreme Court case where justice put on record that I have already set out that British Columbia is in a public health emergency. As part of these circumstances, the plaintiff argued, and I accept, that the unregulated nature of the illegal drug supply is the predominant cause of increasing death rates in British Columbia. So it's not an addiction crisis, it's not an opioid crisis, it is a poisoning emergency, and it's important to frame it that way. We also know that while the media paints a very stereotypical image of who is most affected by this crisis, it's actually everyone in Canada and in British Columbia. And the majority of deaths actually occur inside private residences. It is the leading cause of accidental death in Canada, more than all other causes combined, more than motor vehicle collisions, homicides, and suicides combined. And this is what the drug supply looks like here in British Columbia. This is what's being found in the unregulated drug supply. And so this is far beyond a fentanyl crisis. These black arrows that you see on the screen are fentanyl analogs. And so, yes, fentanyl has been the predominant adulterant in the unregulated drug supply for quite some time. We also see other fentanyl analogs like fluorofentanyl, carfentanil. But we also, since the pandemic, have seen the emergence and now the saturation of benzodiazepines and other non-opioid sedatives in the unregulated drug supply. And this is causing immense amounts of challenges for people because, well, benzos are not opioids. And so our naloxone doesn't work quite the same. People are experiencing prolonged sedation, amnesia, really, really terrible wounds that are difficult to manage in community. And it just goes to show that when we rest our laurels on a single drug, when we get hyperfixated on a single drug, then we fall behind, because this isn't about stopping fentanyl. It's about addressing a system that is continuously pushing the drug supply to an increasingly toxic and volatile state. And we've got more challenges because of that ever-evolving drug supply, one of which that we're grappling with in British Columbia is the rise of hypoxic and anoxic brain injury. And so a recent study in British Columbia found that people who experienced a toxic drug event were 15 times more likely to have encephalopathy or brain injury than people who did not experience a drug toxicity event. Why am I telling you this? What does this have to do with the Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act? Well, one, as I said, I've had the unfortunate displeasure of being a witness to the evolution of this drug supply. And what I've noticed in my time as a nurse is that it is imperative that we reduce the amount of time to emergency response. We reduce any delays to emergency response. And all the way back when fentanyl was first emerging in the drug supply and I was working in a naloxone project, I was begging people, please stay with them. If someone overdoses, please call 911 and please stay with them. And it was a really hard sell because people had been criminalized, people had been arrested, people had experienced violence at the hands of the police. And so there's a lot of reluctance to call 911. It also matters because Canada's progressiveness is a myth. We've been pushed into some of these new interventions. We've been pushed to innovate, not because we've been proactive about responding to the drug poisoning emergency, but as you can see, because we are in the throes of it still. And so we've had to think outside of the box. But as our first speaker noted, if you were to walk around in any major urban center in Canada, you wouldn't think that we have things under control. The Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act is supposed to help keep people alive, help reduce lack of oxygen to the brain, help reduce the risk of death, but it doesn't address our other structural problems like the rising rates of homelessness, the housing crisis, poverty, unresolved mental health challenges, a lot of which you probably will see if you walk through Pandora or the downtown east side. And the other reason why this matters is because any delay in medical intervention can mean irreparable harm. It's not just about death now, it's about the lasting permanent damage that happens if there are any delays in an effective response. And so Canada's drug laws continue to drive drug supply volatility and heighten the risk for harm by promoting covert drug use. But the Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act is an attempt to reduce the harm of that. It is a harm reduction law. So the Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act was enacted in 2017. It encourages people to call 911. It encourages people to remain on scene of an overdose until emergency health services arrive. And it is a reform policy that reflects that it's not always in the public interest to prosecute someone for calling 911 at the scene of an overdose. And ultimately, the goal is to reduce the fear of calling 911. There are issues that the law seeks to address, one of which is the reluctance to call 911 due to fear of being charged with a criminal offense or fear of a penalty. This includes fear of arrest for including, the stigma and the judgment that comes with being arrested. And it also is to, protect young people who are especially fearful of being arrested due to the risk of their parents being informed or potentially punishing them. The Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act was enacted in 2017, amended the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act to grant immunity from charges or conviction of simple drug possession and breaches of release conditions related to possession when someone calls emergency services for an overdose or remains on scene. There are a number of debates, amendments, and court challenges, some of which the Harm Reduction Nurses Association has actively been involved in. There are challenges, like the fact that the law does not explicitly address whether police are prohibited from arresting someone under such circumstances, even if the person ultimately cannot be charged or convicted because of the Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act. There's also been some issues with it being limited to a medical emergency and what the interpretation of that might be. One of Canada's provinces, Quebec, actually broadened the scope over several legal interpretations to include language like risk to life or serious harm, and then reasonable grounds to believe that the situation involves a medical emergency, which is intended to reduce the burden on the caller. There was also a Supreme Court case that is still underway. In the case of Paul Wilson, there was an overdose that occurred in rural Saskatchewan in September of 2020. Even though his group called 911, the RCMP arrested him. But the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal ruled in Wilson's favor, concluding that the purpose of the Good Samaritan Overdose Act was to encourage people to call 911 without fear of police action. But now it's being reviewed before the Supreme Court of Canada. And at issue is, does the criminal code authorize the arrest of an individual at the scene of a drug overdose for simple drug possession if that person may ultimately be immune from being charged or convicted under the Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act? And so I myself, on behalf of the Harm Reduction Nurses Association, was part of a coalition of interveners in this case. And we explained that any delays could result in death, and that we actually train people when we do overdose response. Stay with the person who's overdosed. You're protected under the Good Samaritan laws. And so any changing of this law, any narrowing or restrictions will mean that people will go back to leaving folks. They sometimes will inject naloxone, put them in recovery position, and then they'll leave. And oftentimes that's still not enough, because oxygen is the most important thing, especially in preventing brain injury. I just wanted to touch a little bit on the take-home naloxone project as well. Canada, as I'm sure my research has shown, Wales has as well, access to take-home naloxone. Naloxone has been probably one of our greatest tools in combating this crisis. And even though our rates of death are still very high, the studies have shown that were we not able to scale up mass distribution of naloxone, overdose deaths would be at least twice as high. And there's some important linkages to the Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act, because this data comes from between April 2016 and December 2017, and the Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act was implemented in May 4th of 2017. And so we really did see an uptake of naloxone use, and we also saw an uptake in people staying with folks while waiting for EMS with the emergence of the Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act. Lastly, there are some lessons to glean from here. The lesson is simple. If people are not sure they will be safe, then they simply won't call. And when seconds count, uncertainty can kill. So clarity matters in the law. Ambiguous language will undermine trust. Immunity should be broad and simple. It has to be framed as a health, not enforcement issue. Emergency services like paramedics and ambulance should lead. Police should only be there for safety, if not at all. Youth protections are paramount. There's a lot of paternalism in drug law where we create harm reduction programs or harm reduction legislation, and then we completely exclude the youth, who are oftentimes at the greatest risk and are likely most fearful of repercussions of being implicated in something like a drug overdose response. We have to shift our orientation. If the true public interest is in protecting life, not enforcing possession laws. Take a lesson from Canada. Safeguard yourselves from moral panic and reactionaries, because we are actually in a regressive swing now in Canada. A lot of our innovations are being clawed back. And to that end, also beware of administrative creep. Anytime, there's a lot of gray area where discretion is allowed, that also leads to potential for racial profiling. That also leads to the potential that some people are more impacted, whereas others benefit from the law, and that is inequitable. Thank you so much.
Cory, thank you so much. I mean, it really, obviously in Canada, you've got a different profile in terms of the problems that you face, but there are lots of commonalities as well. And I have read and I understand about all the clawbacks that are happening at the moment, which must be very nerve-wracking for people in the field over there, and the worry that such progressive and such advances that you've made, that the rest of the world look on to, and now by stealth being taken away. That must be pretty depressing on a day-to-day basis. And interesting, really, I suppose, for me, thinking about, for this, it's about how you keep it as simple as you possibly can, any Good Samaritan law, because you've got to get that communication, because people will always fear. And as you say, when you're talking about some people, the administrative, trying to change it or arresting, and then you can't, but the arrest has already taken place and that message has gone out. So it's interesting to see those and learn those lessons from Canada. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to open it now to any questions.
I think quite a nice one to start on, as kind of segue from what you just said. How can we combat the growing reactionary sentiment? Is there any way that is more effective than others?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I like I said, I spend a lot of time learning about mis and disinformation, and that is a central driver of these reactionary policies for sure. We're also, even at the federal level, seeing policy regression, and that's being driven by external forces like a president of the South who is imposing tariffs and threatening to annex our country if we don't do things that are more drug war-ish. So some of these things feel big and out of our control. However, what I have found is politicians are here to get votes, and they're here to get into power. And so rather than convincing the politicians, dedicating our energy to building the capacity of the public to be able to discern and critically appraise policy, and to cut through the rhetoric and to say, how will this policy stop the deaths? How will this policy ensure that people can be safe? I think that will be one of the most effective tools, because we have so many studies. We've got, for one example, we have safe supply in Canada, and all of that is being clawed back and taken away despite over 110 peer-reviewed studies that demonstrate positive outcomes from it. So it's not about evidence always. It's about being able to mobilize public opinion and to apply that pressure onto our elected officials so that they know this is something that they will be supported to do, because they move in the direction of the voters, unfortunately.
Thank you. Also, kind of picking up on something that Caroline just mentioned, there's a question. In light of the Act being enacted as one of many responses to the poisoning and emergency and its severity, how well has the Act been communicated across the country to its citizens? Has it been communicated via mainstream media, adverts, TV, that kind of stuff?
Oh, that's really great. Yeah, we've had some public awareness campaigns. There have been some kind of, like radio advertisements and things like that have come out, especially about encouraging people to call 911, stay with the people. We have toxic drug alerts, which often go out through health authorities, which are like little kind of sectors covering different regions of the province, and they encourage people to stay with folks. We've invested in apps like the Brave app, which obviously has an embedded witness there who can call 911. And then there was a very concerted effort to embed education about the Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act into the take-home naloxone training. And I think that's probably been the most effective tool, is when training people and providing them with the kits of reviewing the law and of being really clear about what the law does and doesn't do, or does and doesn't allow. At least from an anecdotal perspective, in the hundreds of people that I've trained and provided kits to, it's been a central component of my training. And I find that that's probably the most effective place to get people to really understand it.
Thank you. We've got a question about naloxone actually from Gavin Jones, who's our head of organisation for our Gwent Drug and Alcohol Service. And he's asked, do you have any public access naloxone in BC? We're trying to change legislation in Wales to allow our continued use.
I've seen little kind of pilots of like naloxone kit vending machines, or kind of other kind of non-human dispensation. We've even had like harm reduction vending machines that have now been removed because of these reactionary politics, saying that it promotes drug use, or whatever tired old rhetoric that we've heard for decades now about interventions that keep people safe. But we have widespread accessibility. Like so you can go in British Columbia, for example, you can go to the website Toward the Heart, and there is the naloxone kit finder tool. And it's available in hundreds of pharmacies, doctors' clinics. It really is quite accessible. And as soon as naloxone was descheduled, it really opened the door. I recall having to convince prescribers to write prescriptions for naloxone, and to try and find, and even then there was reluctance and resistance to that. So we have good access, but we don't have a ton of kind of just like, because they really want people to get the training alongside it as well, especially with the advent of prolonged sedation and benzodope. It's really helpful. The airway and breathing component of an overdose response is ever more important with the drug supply changing and not being exclusively opioids.
We actually had a question again from Gavin about some of the issues around benzo. So with the extra adulterants such as benzo types like bromazepam, how are you treating the benzo withdrawal when people are starting on OST?
Well, that's a great question. Yeah, I'm on the clinical expert committee for the BC Centre for Substance Use. There is an actual new resource that is expected to be published soon, specifically about management of benzodiazepine contamination and withdrawal. But it's challenging. I work in prescribed alternatives and OAT, which I believe is your version of OST. And it's already a challenge to help people stay on their methadone or their Cadian or their Suboxone, especially when they're just getting started and they're early in the titration and they're not feeling well. And so retention is already a challenge. And now we've got this new emerging challenge of benzodiazepine withdrawal. And so with the way that the benzos have saturated the unregulated drug supply, if you're using unregulated drugs, you are probably developing a physical dependence to benzodiazepines, which is not the same as a substance use disorder or an addiction, but it means when you stop using it, so people are doing well on their methadone, they stop using their unregulated supply, they start to feel awful because benzo withdrawal is a terrible, terrible experience. It could be life-threatening, it could cause seizures. And they confuse it for dope sickness. They confuse it for opioid withdrawal. And so it makes it even more difficult to help people stick it out. There are a number of interventions. We develop teaching tools helping people recognize the difference between benzo and opioid withdrawal, which I'm happy to share some of those as well. And ultimately, if it's worrisome, oftentimes people will need medical supervision during the withdrawal phase. Otherwise, we're looking at increasing the amount of assessments. There's even the potential to do a community taper. But those are all increasingly challenging when people are also experiencing homelessness and they're also experiencing structural violence and their day-to-day is inconsistent. So we're not well equipped for this new iteration of the drug supply, which is why I'm trying to tell, whenever I get the fortunate opportunity to be at an international stage, I say, don't wait to be in the horrible position that Canada and the United States are with the unregulated drug supply. Be proactive about these interventions, be proactive about decriminalization, safe supply, all of those necessities, because even our safe supply programs probably would have been a lot more effective in 2016 when we declared an emergency first and we were just dealing with fentanyl, than when we were in the heat of the pandemic and grappling with benzodope and even xylazine, which is an animal tranquilizer and is not a benzodiazepine that we now have fairly consistently in Canada.
Brilliant. Yeah, fascinating. I just I wish we could take all of this and kind of put it into the right ears. Unfortunately, not all of them are on this call, but you're kind of touching on that a little bit. But what do you think? One of the questions is, what do you think needs to change to make a real difference to this emergency? I know there's lots of stuff going on, but what do you think would make kind of, I suppose, the biggest difference? What would really help?
Yeah, I mean, you're welcome to have a look at the Harm Reduction Nurses Association's position statements. We've been pretty clear about this, and we're in alignment with other organizations across Canada. And so I feel comfortable saying that we do know the solutions, but it takes courage, and it takes actually upending some structures that even some of our most liberal elected officials would deem to be a non-starter from a re-election standpoint. But at the heart of this is criminalization and also colonization. And so Canada has never even scratched the surface of the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that happened. We continue to criminalize people who use drugs, and even BC's short pilot with decriminalization was a pseudo decriminalization that was doomed to fail from the onset. We need full decriminalization. We need a legally regulated drug supply for all drugs, and then we need voluntary treatment, and we need to address the social determinants of health. We need to get people housed. We've got in Metro Vancouver, homelessness increased by 32% over the pandemic. And all people complain about is public drug use, but it's, if they had
where
homes,
else
you
are they
wouldn't
going
see
to go?
it.
Yeah.
Right. And with the state of the drug supply they use in public spaces, because if they die, someone's going to revive them. It's a harm reduction measure that they're taking. And so there's lots that we can do, and we know what the solutions are. What we're really grappling with is the disconnect between evidence and policy, and trying to understand how to bridge that gap. Because as I said, we're heading in the opposite direction now, unfortunately. We're more interested in voluntary drug treatment in Canada now than we ever were about decriminalization.
I mean, what you said during your talk, Cory, about the evidence is there, and my experience is you have evidence across internationally, globally, about a particular intervention or innovation, and if it doesn't fit with the hearts and minds, and if it's there is a simple no, people just, whatever the overwhelming evidence of something's effectiveness doesn't seem to get through, and so how do you then, as you rightly say, take that evidence, create policy, improve practice, and save lives and reduce harm? It's very, very difficult.
So actually, you kind of just jumped into another question when you started to talk about kind of the Truth and Reconciliation stuff about kind of Native Canadians, Indigenous community. So because you talked at the start, you started off with this kind of this message about kind of land theft and colonisation. So how are kind of Native Canadians, Indigenous communities supported with substance use, and what differences, if any, are there working with that group? Are there specialist services available for them? Kind of how does that kind of group of people get supported?
I'll do my best to really acknowledge my positionality and privilege in this conversation, because I'm not an Indigenous person and I don't speak on behalf of First Nations people in so-called Canada. But we know, again, because we have excellent monitoring and surveillance tools, that First Nations people in Canada are disproportionately impacted by homelessness, incarceration, drug poisonings. They make up a very small percentage of this country's population, and yet a very large proportion of these preventable harms. And so what we hear time and time again from Indigenous leaders is that there needs to be Indigenous-led programming, that even harm reduction looks differently from an Indigenous perspective. And oftentimes it's not about reducing the harms of drug use, but about reducing the harms of colonization, and that the unregulated drug poisoning emergency is an offshoot of colonization. And so there are a lot of really great programs out there, like Kalela Lalem in Vancouver's downtown east side. Even more broadly, British Columbia's First Nations Health Authority has put out some incredible resources, including one titled Indigenous Harm Reduction Equals Reducing the Harms of Colonization. But it's not enough. And again, they are subject to scarcity mindsets and precarity of funding. And that is probably one of our biggest challenges across the country, is the incrementalism and the breadcrumbs that get offered to organizations to do a whole bunch with a little, and then to not know if that funding is going to continue in the next year, and even just the ethical implications of starting something and not knowing if you're going to be able to continue it in the following year. It stymies innovation. It impedes us from being able to do bigger, bolder things. And that is a hallmark of the Canadian non-for-profit industrial complex.
Now nod sadly at that one, I think, unfortunately. We feel that. So what we'll do is just a couple of questions specifically about the Good Samaritans Act, if that's okay, and then if there's anything else we can kind of wrap up with that. So one of the questions was, you talked in your talk about the threshold for immunity. So how does the law in Canada define that threshold for immunity?
Not well. It's oftentimes very discretionary. We have attempted to define thresholds for, small amount of possession use in a number of different policies, most recently with BC's decriminalization pilot. And they capped that threshold at 2.5 grams. Which is a tiny amount and does not reflect how people use their drugs or how people even buy their drugs. And so again, the anytime there's gray and subjectivity, that leads to police discretion, and that also leads to the potential for profiling and inconsistent applications of the law. And so, the answer to that is not well. We don't. Yeah.
Brilliant. And just one final question, quite nicely kind of centered back on people who use substances, is kind of what is the sentiment amongst people who use substances about the Good Samaritan Act? Kind of what are their thoughts?
Oh yeah, you should ask a person who uses drugs that question. Just like the question about Indigenous people, I think that there are a lot of really great experts who can speak from those perspectives. But what I would say, just from what I know and working with partners and drug user groups and people who use drugs, is that the Good Samaritan law has been a really important tool in increasing someone's willingness to stick around and to reduce harm and to encourage people to save lives. And people who use drugs have been at the forefront of this crisis in Canada, responding to overdoses and saving the lives of their community members long before larger institutions showed up with more robust and better resource policies and programs. But I would also say that it doesn't go far enough, as we've seen from some of the limits and some of the debates. It doesn't, it doesn't fully protect people. There is still ambiguity, and so I'm quite certain I can say with confidence that these drug user groups and people who use drugs would say that it still represents some incrementalism when we know that the problem, the root cause, is criminalization. And so this, it is a harm reduction law. And so harm reduction reduces the harm of laws and policies. So it's actually a law out there to reduce the harm of Canada's other laws, which should be an admission that we should deal with the harmful law rather than building exemptions and exceptions to the thing that's putting people in dire straits.
Fabulous, thank you. Well, that's kind of all our questions. If anyone's got any more, please do feel free to pop in the chat. But Caroline, I'll hand over to you to kind of finish us up.
Thanks, Lucy, and thanks for all the people who asked questions. They were really good. But primarily, thank you for Cory for answering them so well. And that's been really interesting, fascinating insight into your work and your world over there. Depressing at times, but I suppose we're all in that space and just really trying to push the policy discussion. Get people to listen. Sometimes that feels incredibly frustrating. But it's events like these and you agreeing to speak on our webinars that really help motivate people and share that information and make people think differently. And let's hope that by all thinking differently, we can make things happen differently in the future together. So thank you very much. You'll probably be your kids will be coming down now. Ready for breakfast. So thank you very much, and thank you for Peredur. I don't know whether Peredur is still on the call. Thank you so much for coming along today and being a support of this sector and being open. Unlike many politicians, being open to the evidence and open to thinking a different way. And thank you all for attending, and thank you to Lucy, Verity, and to Rob for making these happen. And have a good day, everybody.
If you have been affected by any of the issues discussed in today's podcast, please reach out. Barod have a free and confidential live web chat service that is available 7 days a week on our website at barod.cymru, where you can chat to a trained support worker. Alternatively, you can contact Wales's National Drug and Alcohol Helpline, Dan 24/7. either by calling 0808 808 2234 or text Dan to 81066.